We now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but never good night and never goodbye. I'm Rev Nathaniel W Martin, pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in Los Angeles, California, and welcome you to another episode of It's Time. We're calling these episodes now, and we welcome you to join us. Let us look at the Word of God. That's the theme of our episodes, and we're dealing with the reparations, dealing with fairness in pay, fairness in salaries, and all of its various manifestations, if you like. Let's read the Word of God. It says, thou in Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning at verse number 14, it says, thou shalt not oppress, that means hold down, an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. At his day or at her day thou shalt give them, let's use that word, their hire. Neither shall the sun go down upon it, because they are poor, and they set their heart upon it, lest they cry out against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. Notice that God equates holding back somebody's money with oppressing them, because you can understand that in a capitalistic system, if you don't have no money, you are oppressed. And if someone is holding back due money, legal money, honest funds that should honestly have been transferred from the person owing you to yourself, you certainly can readily understand the pain and the agony and the distress and the anxiety and the angst and the anger that you will experience from not having no money. I don't like to walk around with no money now, and I'm sure you can relate to that. But God looks upon it as oppression. If you are holding back somebody's money, you are oppressing them. You are oppressing them. The word is oppression. Argue with the Bible. Don't argue with me. And that goes in every, from the individual to the company, to the family rather, then to the community, to the company, to the corporation, to the government, whether it's city, county, state, or federal or international. It makes no difference. If there is an agreement, and if you owe, and you are supposed to uphold your portion of that agreement, and it's like a person trying to walk across a stream on stepping stones, and if the stone that they have to walk on ain't there, what are they going to do? They're going to fall in the water. But if you had put that stone there, if you'd have paid them their money, they could have paid the rent. You don't hear me? Or they could have bought what they needed for the baby. Or they could have paid their car note. Or they could have bought the necessary food for a meal at home. If you owe me, you're supposed to do what? Pay me. I got my Bishop Bullwinkle hat on today because there's so much bull going on in our communities and in our world, and the government of our United States of America is at it. It goes without saying that under the present administration, there's a lot of bull going on. I'm talking about Bullwinkle, Bishop Bullwinkle, and there's a lot of things that give one pause, and so we have to address that. God addresses it. God says you can't say you owe somebody money and you don't have it, and they know you got it in your pocket. You got it in your bank account. You got it in your funds, but you what? Holding on to somebody else's money. It's like dealing with the banks around this country. They hold your money. They're making big money off of your money. They're only paying you 2% on your money, and if you're not careful, they'll charge you some type of a fee that cuts into your money. Look at what Wells Fargo has got to pay out right now because of that very thing, defrauding the customer, the humble customer in their bank. Now let's go farther into the New Testament. See what God has to say. A lot of folks don't like the Old Testament. You say that because that's what? It's old. All right, let's look at the New. The New Testament says, "Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have what? Have reaped, entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." And so in the New Testament, God is even more emphatic that people are to be paid what they are due. Matter of fact, the whole theme of the Bible is paying you what you are due. Recompense. God is a God of recompenses. He told Habakkuk, though it tarry long, wait for it, for at the end it will speak and not lie. Don't give up on God, because God will pay off. He will make your enemy your footstool. And so we have a label this episode Bull. Notice, if you please, that we have a HUD secretary now who knows nothing about housing. His name is one Dr. Ben Carson, a very gifted neurosurgeon who has performed countless difficult neurosurgeons, separating conjoined twins and the like. And the twins are still alive. He's a great neurosurgeon, but he's a very, very inept, totally out of his league when it comes to housing. And this is who's over the housing of HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development, as it is called. I draw your attention to that because housing is one of the number one things in the nation. You got to have somewhere to stay. Before God created man, He developed somewhere for man to stay. You got to have somewhere to stay before the sun go down. And that just goes without saying. The Bible says you must have somewhere to stay. The first thing God developed in the earth was somewhere for man to stay, to live. Is that right? And a lot of us depend on public housing. And this nation was built on public housing. As you heard me say on other broadcasts, and if you haven't heard it, go back and look at some of the other episodes that we have up now. I think we got quite a few episodes up now where you can look and see the pattern of this nation, this great nation in which we live, going from 1900 on up even to now. Although we focus in on the end of the Johnson administration, which and his passage of what became known of the Fair Housing Act, which previously was known as the Federal Housing Administration. And under the Federal Housing Administration, from the Great Depression at the end of 1929 on through, they had developed these various housing requirements, these housing schemes, and they were putting people in the suburbs when the suburbs were built. And the only thing about the suburbs is that you had to meet the qualifications, the underwriting qualifications, the loaning qualifications. And make a long story short, if you were white or Caucasian, you could get the house, get the loan, get the funding, get the insurance, and get your ticket to the American dream. But if you were not white or Caucasian, regardless of how much money you had, then, of course, you were denied. That was the requirement. And that's the way it was up until April, when Dr. King was killed in April of 1968. The bill that had been languishing, Fair Housing Bill, that had been languishing in Congress and had been filibustered and had been tabled by the Southern Democrats with the help of many Northern Democrats and Republicans. Johnson was finally able to muscle that act on through. That's what created the current HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Its mandate was to fight discrimination in housing. That's what HUD is supposed to do, fight discrimination in housing. And it is responsible for mortgage lending, is responsible for home protection, homeowner protection. It's responsible for making housing affordable and community development. Your community development block grant funding that comes from HUD. It also investigate claims of discrimination in housing, and its primary mission statement is to combat housing discrimination. That's what HUD is all about. But now, under the leadership, the tutelage of Secretary of HUD, Monsieur Ben Carson, now suddenly they want to revise the mission statement of HUD, and they want to no longer focus on the anti-discrimination in housing language. They want to deal with an abstraction. See, housing discrimination, that's concrete, but an abstraction, which sounds good, which they call self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is an abstraction. Housing discrimination is a concretion, because you got to have somewhere to stay. And if I say you can't stay you can't stay there, you can't stay there, well, I'm discriminating. Why am I discriminating? What is the basis of my discrimination? And in the United States, you cannot discriminate against any person on the basis of their so-called gender, nationality, what are the other requirements? One of the least of which now is race, since we know race no longer is not a genetic or DNA viable classification anymore, but it's still on the books, and we are still discriminated against on the basis of our race. Simply look at your many news broadcasts and see how discrimination is unfolding all across this nation. No, we are not a post-racial society, but not leaving that. The purpose of HUD was to combat what had previously been the SOP. HUD was to rewrite the rules for housing, for mortgage lending, and for the necessary insurance in order to have housing. If you don't have insurance, you can't have a house. We all understand that, because a lot of us are homeowners. And what HUD does, it controls Section 8 vouchers. And according to what we're hearing, 4.5 million people are going to be affected by Dr. Carson's new policy. And his new policy is that he's going to raise the minimum for the rent from $50. Person could afford $50. And he's going to say you multiply that by 3. Now you got to pay a minimum of $150. A minimum of $150. To some of us, it doesn't sound like much, but to those of us who are struggling, it's a whole lot. Especially if you're of those who have to purchase medicine, fulfill prescriptions, and then struggle with not having adequate job that pays an adequate wage. And then a lot of us are jobless. One of our radio broadcasters talks about unwaged work. Well, a lot of us do that unwaged work. And we can just barely make ends meet as it is. But under Ben Carson, it will become harder for the people already struggling to continue to exist at a modicum level. And believe it or not, my brothers and sisters, we are becoming a nation of homeless people. We have more people outdoors, sleeping under bridges, sleeping down in the dry riverbeds and along at all kinds of places now because they can't afford to live in their house. They've been put out of their apartment. They've lost their homes. They've been evicted, and they are now dealing with homelessness. And God sets the solitary in families. It's not the will of God anybody be outdoors. That's man's will. It's not the will of God that anyone be without shelter. That's man's will. I don't get me wrong. I know you got some hard-headed folks out there. Some are. And then, because I got a young man in my church, very retarded and mentally unstable, and he had the nerve to want to get married and didn't have nowhere to stay for his old lady to stay. How you going to get married? Didn't have a job. How you going to get married? Couldn't buy a marriage license. How you going to get married? And so you got some hard problems out there. But those are the ones that God sent you and I to address. Try to be of much help as we can. My point for this today is that if Ben Carson is successful and he is able to impose these triple the rent, so to speak, that people have to pay in order to be in these affordable housing or whatever they call it, then it's going to have a very harmful and unfair effect upon the poor. And people like myself, I consider myself as poor. In fact, I know I'm poor. I'm not even upper middle class. I'm just holding on. And the Lord have blessed that I have somewhere to lay my head at night. But how many other people don't have somewhere to lay their head, but may have lost where they had to lay their head? Things are happening. Things are changing. A lot of us are just one paycheck away from being outdoors. And your heart must go out to your brothers and your sisters. And when you got a tyrant like Ben Carson in charge of such a vital government agency as HUD, and you have a administration that is anti-government, that believes that the government has been doing too much to help the poor, or the government has been doing too much to help the middle class. And mind you, there's the what's so-called upper middle class. They're holding on by their fingernail. And then there's the lower middle class, and that's the people who just might be coming out of poverty and just maybe getting somewhere where they have a house and they have a car and they have some clothes to put on and some shoes to put on their feet. There's a little bit more food in the refrigerator than they used to have before. And so that's lower middle class. You haven't got nowhere yet. You're just barely getting to where you have a little bit more than you ever have had before. You're really not up out of poverty, yet you still can smell the stench of poverty in your nostrils. But you are putting up a little bit better. And if you don't lose your job, and if they don't take away your raise, and if they don't go up on the cost of living, which they always do, then you have a chance to do a little bit better if your health holds out. Now, HUD, Dr. Carson has cut 3,300, rather, let's do it this way. HUD is responsible for 3,300 public housing authorities. That's all across this nation, 3,300, which covers 1.2 million units of housing. That's whether you're talking about an apartment or whether you talk about a house, or whether you're dealing with Section 8 vouchers for 2 million families, not 2 million people, but 2 million families. Families, my brothers and my sisters, we are in a crisis with Dr. Carson over HUD. Now, they have already cut the funding for HUD by 15%. They cut the budget for HUD by $7 billion. That's $7 billion with a B dollars, And now Section 8 recipients are being forced to pay 17% more of their fixed income toward their rent than under the previous administration. That includes President Obama's administration. And so the HUD is now cutting out 200,000 Section 8 vouchers. In other words, there are 200,000 less vouchers out there. But there are probably millions more homeless out there. And how do you address that in order to, as a policy, except say that is bull, and the overall funding for public housing, get this, all across this nation, that's coming out from the government as being cut by 68%. Public housing has been cut under Ben Carson, under Donald Trump, by 68%. Now remember, we open up talking about the fact of the inequity or the inequality of the federal housing administration from the Great Depression onward through 1968, in that there was intentional redlining, there was intentional discrimination, intentional segregation, intentional marginalization of a major portion of the population of these here United States of America. And one of the major requirements was to get your loan funded, to get your insurance underwritten, so you could have a chance to have a house, was that you had to be Caucasian or you had to be white, and you take that and deal with it. And that was done right here in these here United States of America. So that means you had one segment that was subsidized to get into housing, but the other segment of the population was not subsidized. Now, look at in Los Angeles, we have what you call Hawaiian Gardens, Jordan Downs, Pueblo del Rio, Nickerson Gardens, and several others. I can't name them all. But all of those are what you call housing projects. Mind you, right now they're redoing Jordan Downs. What they're doing, they're putting some nice-looking townhouses on the lots across the street from the current Jordan Downs facilities. And the thought is that the people that are currently in Jordan Downs will have first opportunity to rent these brand new, fine, good-looking places. What's going to happen is that the people in Jordan Downs are on what? The same fixed income, the same SNAP, the same WIC, the same welfare that they've been on all the time. They don't have the money to afford to move into these upscale, good-looking townhomes that are going to be built to replace the Jordan Downs current housing units. Now, is that fair? No. Is that a fair recompense? No, because the people in Jordan Downs are already poor. So that means that these poor people are going to be displaced. Where are they going to go when they can't afford to stay in these new places? If HUD's public housing assistance is being cut 68%, that means you're putting people not in new housing, you're putting people out in the streets. And so this is outrageous. It's an inequity. No wonder the old prophet said, let judgment roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Righteousness would mean that these people who are currently in Jordantown get these new places for at least an entire generation, rather than being pushed aside or displaced, where they got to go now to find where they can. And a lot of them are going to wind up way out there in the desert, in Lancaster, or in Palmdale, or in some other area far removed from metropolitan Los Angeles. Some of them going to have to move to Nevada in order to find a place that they can afford to live. And that's the point, affordable housing. And so we are in a conundrum. We are in a very dangerous social position or condition here in our country economically, because the jobs that the poor used to pull up on, those jobs are not there anymore. Goodyear's closed. Once upon a time, General Motors was over here. That's gone. And all B.F. Goodrich, all of those companies that were lining up and down Firestone Boulevard and all over, a lot of those companies are no longer here for you to get a good job in. So the job that the poor used to climb up to the middle class, those jobs are not there no more. And the jobs that are out there are not paying an adequate living wage. I believe in Santa Monica they had what they call a living wage rather than a minimum wage. A minimum wage was $5, but a living wage was at least $15 and up, because the cost of living is up at $30, $35 an hour. And these things, these things are crucial. And so when we look at the way that the policies are being shifted in the agencies that are charged with the task of fighting discrimination in housing, you can readily see that it's some time for all of us to speak up about getting paid, because we're being denied adequate housing, we're being denied due process, we're being denied the equal protection of the Constitution, and all of that is going to impact adversely, not just me, not just you, but the entire society. And don't be so smug, say, well, I live in a house and I get my house is paid for. Because if these other people don't have nowhere to stay, you're not going to be too comfortable where you are. And we cannot see our brother languishing, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, on the Jericho road of life. Don't forget that many in the SCLC look down upon the garbage workers in Memphis. But Dr. King said, we must get with those garbage workers because they are the disinherited, the dispossessed. They are the little people, the little man on the totem pole. And we must speak up for our sisters and our brothers, you see, because the powers that be don't want to pay you what they owe you, and they want to take away from you the things that you have, and that cannot be allowed to continue. Always remember, don't work for nobody that's not going to pay you. This government owes you at least from 1900 up to now. If they don't want to pay you for slavery, I think they should pay you for slavery, because the legacy of slavery is still there. But as my closing, always remind you, my brothers and my sisters, if we don't speak up against this government or to this government, then they will continue to defraud us in our wages and in our services. It is time for all of us to realize that we need and we must get paid. God bless you. May God keep you, as our considered prayer. May God watch over you and provide for you and for yours. All right.